Now, here on the T-Rex podcast, we've had book reviews and we've had interviews, but this is the first time I'm interviewing an author about the book. I have someone here who has written a book that I'll just start with the book review. I recommend the book. So my guest today on T-Rex Talk is Jon Harris. Jon Harris has written the book Against the Waves. That's the one that we're going to be talking about mostly today, but I want to talk about some other stuff with you, Jon, as well. So welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your patience with me and my computer issues. I know this is our second go at trying to do this, and should work this time.
Second try is great. We had the great beginning of a conversation. So now we should probably go back and have the beginning of the conversation again, just for the the third chair. But tell me a little bit about yourself. The book that you have written, Against the Waves. One of my favorite things about it is it categorizes a bunch of the political ideologies that swirl around. It feels like there's more of those today than I remember there being in the past, at least when I was, growing up in politics. But what's your relationship? How did you get into this fight? Because I've seen you. Our paths, I don't know that we've ever met in real life. Our paths have crossed on the internet, and we have mutual friends. I know you as a documentary filmmaker, a musician, and a writer. How did you come to write this book?
Yeah, so I think I had your brother David on the podcast years ago. And we had a good conversation about Second Amendment stuff. And so that might be where we crossed paths. I'm not sure. But at that time, which was like 2021, we didn't know what was going to happen with a presidential election. And so I started getting into all of that stuff. And I've always been conservative politically. I come from a family that's been conservative and patriotic. And my dad's actually a pastor, so I had I suppose a number of interests that converged. I loved American history. I have 2 degrees in history. I love this country, and I'm a Christian. And those things seem to have converged on when I was in seminary, resisting the social justice takeover that was happening at the school I was at. And I recorded some opposition to that. It went viral in 2019. It was January of that year. And since then, I was never intending to have a podcast, but overnight I had a platform. And so people all of a sudden wanted to know what I had to say. And I didn't think I would tackle the social justice issue to the extent I did, but it became obviously a bigger threat the next year. And so I wrote 2 books about it. I actually reworked my entire thesis that I was working towards in grad school. And instead of doing the Dutch history of New York, I started working on the social justice infusion into evangelicalism in the 60s and 70s. And that became Social Justice Goes to Church. And then since then, I've written just a number of things on culture and politics. And this book that you're holding, Against the Waves, it's some of the clippings, if you will. It's some of the things. They're actually self-contained essays, most of them. So they're things that I've written over the course of about 3 years that that didn't really fit into those social justice books, but I thought that they were very important, and it became that book. And really the thing that held it together more than anything else was an opposition to liberalism, both in liberal, or you could say, and these terms obviously are kind of, you have to pin them down because people have different conceptions of them.
Right.
Whether
conservative
left or right
is one of... Yeah, conservatism and liberalism are 2 of the least substantial terms right now. They mean less probably now than they've ever meant in the past.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think as you said in the opening, there seems like there's more ideological options than there's ever been. And I think part of that's the internet. You have more platforms and everyone's got their own take, where we went wrong, what the solutions are. And so you're going to have your libertarians and now even your neo-Nazi types and your paleo conservatives, of which I'm one, or your theonomists, or the list goes on and on and on. And multiple groups will claim the mantle of the right or conservatism, or on the left, there's multiple groups that will claim they're the true authentic leftists. So obviously I'm on the right and I'm seeing these competing factions, and for me, I want to champion a traditional American, Anglo-American, if you will, conservative outlook, the kind of outlook that my dad had and my grandpa had and my grandpas before him had in general. We might not have all agreed on everything, but we had the same impulses and instincts. And I think that's being somewhat lost in the clutter here. And so I want to recapture that. And I want to especially contrast that to the main competitor, which has taken over conservative or right-leaning institutions in the last 50 years. And that's liberalism or neoconservatism. There's different words people use. Usually neoconservatism insinuates a foreign policy perspective. Liberalism is more broad. And I have to define all these things. So I do define them in the book.
Right.
And we can get into that if you want. But I also go into a little bit of some of the dissident right and even some of the more bioreductionist or racial determinist stuff that's coming in and my perspective on that. So.
Yeah, so that's why I think that this is a particularly, what I found helpful was, I think we're maybe sort of kind of the same age, but I'm remembering growing up in the 80s and 90s and watching there be kind of 3 or 4 main political forces in Washington, and you definitely had your neoconservatives, and you had your paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan. People kind of split the Republican Party into those 2 camps, or conservatism in D.C. into those 2 camps. And then on the left, you definitely had sort of generic Democrats, and then you had more ideologically driven firebrands. And that was my grid. That was my quadrant. Everything made sense. I could put people into one of those 4 buckets. It was easy. But yeah, things seem much more confused now, and people are staking out little bits of territory that in the past belonged to the other side. So, like, Bill Clinton used to be the deport all the illegals guy. Different groups have been on board with different parts of environmentalism, and there are really seriously conservative people who are on board with stewardship of resources that looks like environmentalism. But then there's environmentalists who are hardcore, eradicate the human race, Green Planet people who want to wipe out forests to put solar panels in. So, like, it's just, it feels messier than it's ever been before.
Most people are probably motivated by fashion and optics and follow the leader. So they might think that they're consistent with their political principles, but oftentimes those shift depending on the situation and the person who's at the helm that they're following. And they'll go along with it and be in a different place a decade from now that they are now. And so it's always complicated because humans are complicated. But I do think that because of what happened in 2020 and people wanting to understand how do we get so far off the rails, there's a lot of competition for answering that question, and then the return to normalcy kind of steering that towards the direction that ideologues who have some of the rigid ones who have had these ideologies despite circumstance, they see an opportunity there.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, the internet gives everybody the opportunity for an opinion, a platform, a take, and so things get a little messy. So one of the things that's in the book, I like books that are have a really clear direction, call to action. I also like books that break down different things, like this does, and each one is it is kind of a self-contained thought on nationalism and what is a nation and various aspects of some of these different splinter groups. But is there anything else that you think brought us to this point of so much confusion, so much postmodernism? The internet is obviously a huge factor. You can, I would say even not just the internet, but social media is a huge factor where so many people's information is manipulated by algorithms that are not only outside of their control, but increasingly out of the social media platform's control. So you can get sucked into a little bubble where you never hear another side of the story pretty easily, and possibly even accidentally. So the social media algorithms kind of segregate people into more than the 4 buckets that I had in my brain. Are there other cultural underlying things that you think have driven us to this everybody has their own truth sort of position?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think ideological thinking has a lot to do with this, because think of it as a software or a hardware, really. People once they are into an ideology of some kind, it's very easy to switch sides. And I've noticed this quite a bit with libertarians who go to some other form of dissident right ideology, or even social justice warriors who now are going to be lecturing me on why our biology determines everything else about us. And it's very easy for them to switch, sometimes on the turn of a dime, because it's a revolutionary impulse. It is it's very modern in the sense that it purports to know the almost scientific principles behind everything. It's a totalizing system. And so once people have an ideology that they're used to, it's easy to switch that out and just rearrange some names and some maybe minor things, and you have a completely different ideology, sometimes the opposite ideology in some ways. So I think people are modern thinkers in this sense, and this has been going on for a long time, and we're deracinated. We're separated oftentimes from our past. And in the words of Patrick Henry, let experience be our guide, or John Dickinson, who from Pennsylvania, who said we have a better guide than reason, and he was talking about experience. Those guys are looking to the past. Our founders were very much looking to the past and testing their ideas, right? Even in our Constitution, they're looking at Greco-Roman experience, they're looking at the Bible, and they're saying, what's the best possible arrangement that suits our present circumstance? Not what is the end-all, be-all, final arrangement for all of humankind in a universal sense, because they even allowed the Constitution to be amended, right? Because they didn't think that this would all be figured out right then. But they wanted to base their ideas or base their arrangement on the experience that people before them had. And when you're separated from that kind of experience, then all you have is the present and what people tell you about the present. So I think because we're so separated from the past and we don't have bearings, at least not like we did in previous generations, ideology becomes a lot more attractive. It's kind of like your fast food of politics. Like you can get it real quick. You can learn it real quick. You can become an expert in it real quick. You can master debates real quick with other people because you have the key, and it gives you a false sense of security, I think. And now, because there's so many different kinds of ideologies now, it's easy to get on red team or blue team and react to circumstances. When there's a circumstance that you come across that your ideology doesn't fit, instead of maybe taking that into account and adjusting things, you can just throw out the whole ideology and adopt a new one. And that seems to be the way people are, not just with politics, but with their furniture and with maybe their girlfriends. And, so many different aspects of life are like that, where we just throw it all away. So
you mentioned this disconnect from our past, and the obvious thing to tell people to do is just go read some more history. Is there more to it than that? Because the other thing that I've noticed is that I've been reading modern history books that are written by people who are also disconnected from their past. So they do two things. Number one, they collect a bunch of facts, and then they kind of read into the historical facts their modern interpretation. That obviously isn't really getting them connected to the actual beliefs and the actual people of the past. How do you do that? How can you rebuild that connection?
Yeah. So what you're asking is a historiographical question, and it's similar. I try to explain this to Christians in terms of hermeneutics because they're similar disciplines. And so I'm assuming many of your listeners are Christians. I'm not assuming all of them are, but it might be easier for me to explain it this way. When you're doing a Bible study, there are those studies that you'll go to. They claim to be Bible studies, but everyone has their own take. And no one's take is necessarily wrong. It's just, how do you feel about the passage we read? And that obviously can't be true. There has to be, not everyone's meaning, however ignorant it is, can't be equally true. And so I think historiography is similar to this. When we study the Bible, there are rules to the discipline. We want to take things in context. We want Scripture to interpret Scripture instead of bringing outside sources in that are foreign to the text. We want to make sure we understand what the author's trying to communicate to the audience and not just impose our present meanings. In historiography, that's called presentism. It's a fallacy of history. And so it's the same thing with history. We have an incomplete record because not everyone is everywhere, and sometimes things get recorded that aren't true. And so the historian goes back and tries to understand to the best of his ability, based on what we have, what happened and what's significant. Obviously, that comes because you can talk about an event and pull all the things that aren't significant from it. So what's significant about this event? So part of this is going to be driven, especially if you are, it's your forefathers that you're studying, it's going to be driven by what you've been handed down, what environment you live in, what you see as important. And you'll be able to, I think, because you're in that tradition, sometimes recognize those things a little better for present circumstance. The other thing is you want to try to understand like a paradigm that makes sense of the whole. So if you have facts that lay outside the paradigm and don't make sense of it, then you want to rethink that paradigm. I see this all the time with history, especially American history, which is my focus, where people will go back and study something like, let's say, slavery, and they'll create an image of this institution and the people who participated in it based on a narrow sample. And they won't take the fullness of, well, what did this look like across time and across region and all the various experiences? So no matter what issue you're looking at, you want a paradigm that makes sense of all of it, not just that fits your ideology. And so I do think people are reading history oftentimes through a political lens or an ideological lens, and they'll ransack and cherry pick the things that will help them. I see this happening all the time, and I suppose it's easier for me to recognize now, not because I'm like an expert or anything, but just because after years of going to seminary and then going to a history grad program, I've been exposed to so many quote unquote experts who, when you read them, you're like, okay, this isn't obviously, you're not describing everything that happened in detail. You're pulling out what you want to fit a present political motive.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. And I definitely noticed this with some things. Michael Crichton wrote, I forget the name of the principle. Michael Crichton, the author, had a principle that he pointed out one time, which is people do this with the newspaper. There will be a guy who's a businessman. He'll go to the business section. He'll read an article and he'll say, well, that's not right. This journalist doesn't know what he's talking about. Then he'll turn the page to the very next section and go, oh, it'll be something that he's not an expert in, and he will just believe everything that's on the page, despite the fact that he's already disproven at least one of the journalists at the paper. I do this with books all the time. I've been reading a bunch of books about American history right now and about the founders, and I'll be reading along in some of these books that looks like they have great research in them, and then I'll come to a section that talks about the theology held by specific founding fathers. And they'll say something like, well, John Witherspoon, took a massive departure from historical Christianity when he, advocated for the Articles of Confederation. And it's like, I don't see that at all. I'm reading his words here. This is very much in line with all of his, this is what Scottish Presbyterians believed for hundreds of years. This sounds exactly what John Knox wrote before. Like, I completely disagree with your take on his take on Presbyterianism, and then turn the page and be like, oh, okay, so these are the battle figures. Some discernment is really needed for some of these things, because there are experts who I think get their title of experts maybe because they're ideologically on board with the people who codify experts, or maybe they're really good researchers and they've collected the facts and documents that are hard to turn up and other people haven't found for a while, but then they're oftentimes completely wrong about things just because they haven't studied theology or Christianity or some of the discussion on the basic issues that are being discussed by these guys.
Yeah, I think Daniel Dreisbach is the one who said, if you don't understand Christian theology, don't try to understand the founders, because you won't. And they'll be quoting scripture and it'll just go right over your head. You won't know what they're actually quoting or talking about or referencing. And you could maybe say the same with Greco-Roman literature. You should probably know some of that too, because they quote that as well. But scripture is what they quote far more often. And I think I get to hear these takes even from inside the Christian world sometimes, from usually evangelicals, who oftentimes our politics would be similar on many issues, but they'll start, and I don't mind naming names a little bit here. I don't know. You're not obviously endorsing anything I'm saying, but you got guys
go ahead and name names. That's quite all right.
Yeah. So you got guys like David Barton who will try to argue these guys are evangelical Christians by taking some quotes, right? And then you got guys like Greg Fraser who will try to argue. He has his own category called theistic rationalism. So sometimes you got to be suspicious a little. I'm not saying you can't come up with new categories, but when you're coming up with the first category after hundreds of years, you might want to be a little bit tepid about it. But he tries to argue these guys are theistic rationalists. David Barton's all wrong. And I think the traditional way of approaching it has been that obviously they're a mixed group of people. They're not all the same. They're coming from different denominations. But this is before neo-evangelicalism. This is before fundamentalism. They don't articulate the faith in the same way that we're necessarily used to. And some of them, to be sure, are not like Thomas Jefferson is the main one, and Benjamin Franklin probably. That these guys are not Christians in an orthodox sense. But if you look at different points in their life, they say things that are different. Than like they're complicated people. Benjamin Franklin is a deist supposedly, but then he's calling the Constitutional Convention to prayer, and Thomas Jefferson is supposedly for secularism, and yet he's co-authoring the bill against Sabbath breaking. It's just they're not as you can't fit them into your category so rigidly.
Yeah, the cultural. A good example of this, like there will be cultural assumptions built into even how people quote Bible verses. So right now, today, my Twitter feed is full of people quoting that verse in Leviticus. I should have looked it up. Would have been easy because it's all over my Twitter feed. That says that tells the Israelites how to treat foreigners and sojourners in their land. And on Twitter, if you post that verse, what you mean by it universally is that we shouldn't be deporting people from America. That is the assumption that everybody brings to that verse right now. And so if somebody were to see that verse or other verses in Leviticus quoted by the founders, they might assume that that was what they had in mind for the country. But Scripture is perfect. It is God-breathed. But people do bring assumptions, and cultural baggage gets attached to specific verses. And in reality, that verse talks about the importance of having the same law, actual justice for the citizen and the sojourner. It doesn't mean that sojourners get special treatment or they're above the law. It also means that they're not second-class citizens. They're not denied justice. That verse needs to live in context and be understood, not just be a bumper sticker for one side. And then that side gets to own anybody who's ever quoted that verse in the past, and we get to reframe people 100 years ago that also quoted Leviticus.
Yeah, and the circumstances of the Old Testament were different as well. You had a system wherein people who were foreign could not accumulate land and pass it on from generation to generation, because there was a year of Jubilee. It would revert back to the natives. They had certain things they couldn't participate in, like the temple worship, not to the same extent. They couldn't become kings, so they could never rule over the Israelites. Right. They could be perpetual slaves, but Hebrews could not. Like there are all these things that
also in Leviticus,
them. Yeah, that separated them. And if you want to go back to an approximate arrangement in America and say, well, the foreigners who come here or the illegal migrants who come here, they can never purchase land. They can never have any authority. They are going to always be sort of, and the left would obviously call this a second-class citizen. They would scream, right? But that's the same book that you're quoting from to say they should be treated under equal justice under the law.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, it seems like forever ago now, but it's not that many years ago now that if you mentioned Leviticus on social media, surely you're a homophobe, because that's the verse that was getting pointed out in Leviticus a little while ago. So now the exact same people who are extremely critical of Leviticus are rapid fire posting that other verse from Leviticus. So how do these positions change so quickly? Is it just ignorance plus the speed of a tweet? Or is it when people get unmoored, they're just blown about by every wind of doctrine faster and faster?
Well, the example we're talking about from the Bible is, it's obvious to me why the Bible's used. It's still very influential. It is seen as a moral guide that should be revered, even if you revere it in a way that's more figurative. You don't take everything literally. It's still part of our culture. And so it's to people's advantage to quote the Bible. And it would be a mistake to say that any politician who's ever quoted the Bible must be an evangelical Christian, because there's obviously a political motive for quoting the scripture. If you can get scripture on your side, then there's a large section of the population that's going to be more, favorable to what you're saying. So I think politics is a lot of using imagery and the symbols that a people is used to, and the figures and the heroes that a people is used to, and trying to hit your ideology or hit your vision behind those things and say these things also agree with what I'm saying, and in that way gain support. So I think that's what's happening when people quote the Bible. Maybe from the left, it's also to call out the hypocrisy they see supposedly in the evangelical right. So they say, well, maybe if they really followed the Bible, they would be letting the illegals stay here and live and that kind of thing. So there's complicated reasons for all this, but I think when your base question there about like how do these things switch, I think circumstances change. They change every day, and circumstances, people often are more motivated to change their beliefs based on experiences in their own lives than they are sitting down and rationally thinking through things. Even if they justify it later by saying, I rationally thought through this, generally people seem to react to, you see this in relationships all the time, right? Like, the young man who, I'm going to get married to this nice girl and she's going to be the only one. And then his heart's broken and it's like, you can't trust women. You can't, right? It's like, what changed in his belief? Well, not the only thing that changed was he had a circumstance in his life that sort of took away his sunshine and rose-colored glasses. So I think that's a lot of it. And I think what happened in 2020 was a massive example of this, where people trusted the medical institutions and they thought, well, I can't trust that. The media, the same, the education, the same, sometimes the pastors and the churches, the same thing. And so they're kind of left without confidence in any of these institutions that were supposed to give them the truth. And now they're looking for it. And all of a sudden at the same time, you have online all these voices that sound sometimes convincing, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they are, and then other times though they're just charlatans taking advantage of people who are ignorant. And it's like the prosperity preachers, right? You have people that, why do people buy into that? Well, it does sound good if you don't know what you're talking about, and so we have a vast array of ideologies, and a lot of it's personality driven. There are some real ideologues out there, though, true believers who will sacrifice for the cause.
So what's the solution for that? And when I say the solution, I don't mean for the world. I don't mean for other people. I don't mean for unmoored people who are just going to be catching every single wave. What's the solution for us? How do we actually stand? Convenient title reveal once again. How do we actually stand against the waves, even when they're kind of unrelenting and from all the directions?
So my thesis, if you read the book, is that liberalism has essentially deracinated us, and people will make distinctions in liberalism between classic liberalism, which some will associate with the founders, and then modern liberalism. And I basically say, look, there's impulses that are shared by both of these things throughout time. One of them is that you are an individual, and you can't think in groups, essentially. So this is one of the things that makes Donald Trump unique, is he wants to think in groups. He wants to think about American interests, not just what's best for individuals. And individuals, then the highest good in liberalism is for them to participate in the market in a vast array of choices and self-actualize or pursue whatever end they want. And so it becomes important for them in certain forms of liberalism to subsidize that, or other forms to not subsidize that because that infringes on other people's rights. And so it's this rights talk, this rights language that's stripped of any responsibility. And in this arrangement, that means that diversity is our strength. It doesn't really matter the kinds of people who come, what their cultures are, their religions, their languages. We're just a bunch of individuals pursuing our own interest, and the government's there to make sure that our interests don't infringe on other people's, right? So that's basically a stripped down version of what liberalism is at a core, the root of it. And because we've lived in that, and obviously you can't live in just that. So we have that with a kind of a scaffolding of also some earlier conservative beliefs, because you can never escape tradition. So we still have some of that stuff, but they're conflicting with one another. And my solution is to cast the liberalism asunder, this ideology, this parasitic ideology, and to tap back into the specific, tangible, rooted, traditional things that have made America what it is, and the positive things about America. And so these would be things like our Christianity, specifically our Protestant, our Anglo-Protestant version of Christianity, our our common law tradition that we've inherited from Britain. It would be the heroes, many of whom were knocked down because they didn't fit the 2020 zeitgeist and ideology of that time. Right. But we need those heroes because we need virtue. Without virtue, liberalism doesn't even work without virtue. You've got to have virtue to even have a society that is somewhat workable, and let alone dominant. So getting back to virtuous examples. And so I give, there's other things too, but I give examples of how you can do this in your home, how you can do this on a local level. Localism, federalism is another thing. That's part of our tradition as well, that we have different states and different counties within these states. And this is the reason in 2020, you could be, as I was, next to a county that was a sanctuary COVID county, because the sheriff there wouldn't enforce any of the state mandates. And you could be in a state that wouldn't enforce the federal mandates. And this is, some European countries probably look at that as inefficient, but this is actually part of the genius of our system, is that we actually separate power, and we think the best government is the government that will exist on a local level, because that's where accountability is. That's where you have to live within the boundaries of decisions you make if you're a politician. When you're in Washington and none of the decisions you make affect you, then you get kind of what we're experiencing now with all this centralization. So I give examples of how to get back to that, and we can talk about any of that. But I think it's tapping right back into the conservative, if you want to call it paleo-conservative. I just think of it as the American tradition that has gone back a long ways. There's no reason to abandon it.
Yeah, and there are folks. I mean, the argument exists like, well, that's not going to be sufficient, because the America that we live in today, we've mentioned technology like 50 times. Technology is different, so circumstances are different. So that's not going to be enough. But I honestly believe that the principles were sufficient for different circumstances. If you look at the situation that they were in, yes, they had different technology, but the human condition doesn't change. Human sinfulness doesn't change. I really think that the principles that they were building on from Scripture, and a lot of those decentralized, separated powers and enumerated powers and limited jurisdictions that are in the founding documents, showed that they were really thinking principially about these things. They weren't just you've read the history books that are like, well, the First Amendment, we're not really sure where it came from. Maybe it came from religious freedom. Then the Second Amendment, that they were inspired to put the Second Amendment in there because of Lexington and Concord. And then the Third Amendment was because the British were putting troops inside of houses. And the Fourth Amendment was because the British were stealing powder. It was like, no. These are centuries old ideas of human rights. They didn't just happen, like they didn't just sit down in a Saturday Night Live sketch and say like, what happened yesterday? All right, let's put that, let's make sure that doesn't happen again. Put that down as a human right. I think the principles work regardless of the circumstances that arise, even though they're going to be weird stuff that the founders probably couldn't have predicted. The Fourth Amendment should have stopped the Patriot Act. Like, the Fourth Amendment is a really good principle, even if you have, or I would say, especially if you have a gigantic mass surveillance state apparatus.
Yeah, I think you're right that so these amendments were mostly to satisfy the anti-federalists and get them on board and ratify the Constitution, because they were afraid of centralizing tendencies that would trample on these things. But it does go back to the Magna Carta. It goes back centuries in British common law. These were part of the unwritten British Constitution that the colonists felt had been violated by the Parliament, and the king would not defend them from Parliament. So they're really taking what they know from the British tradition and they're codifying it in a written constitution. And that's the difference between us and the British, is they have an unwritten constitution, ours is written. But we like to think of that. The reality is, though, we're downstream, and now we're figuring out, actually, we have an unwritten constitution, too, because all the civil rights legislation and the post-Reconstruction legislation, that has been interpreted and written into the fabric of what governs this country, even if it's out of step with what the founders themselves would have intended. So I think we have to recognize that we are downstream. This is kind of controversial, but I told someone the other day who was asking me about this, who said, look, I'm into the American tradition. I want decentralization. I want to govern at home. I don't want these positive rights, right? I want negative rights, all of that. And what do we do, though? Because it doesn't seem like most people on the right really want that. They want a Caesar figure. They want someone who's a strong man to come in and just... And this was my answer to him, and you might even disagree with this, I don't know, but I'm all for those things. I'm even, a Southern conservative in a sense. I love Mel Bradford and Richard Weaver and all those guys, Clyde Wilson. So, I mean, I'm a big states' rights guy, but I realize we're downstream from some of these battles. And it may take a Caesarian figure to basically destroy the deep state apparatus. It may take someone coming in, and it's going to look dictatorial. It's going to look authoritarian. But they have to have enough virtue to use that authority to destroy the ring, so to speak, to cast it into the fire. Yeah. And once that takes place, maybe we can get back to that. But it does seem like no matter what, in the last 20, 30 years, no matter what we do, no matter how red a state is, this sort of drift towards centralization just happens. And unless you're a leftist, right? If you're a leftist, you'll say, no, we want our marijuana, or we want our sanctuary cities. It's kind of not often, and it's usually when public opinion is behind something. But I think we do have to strive for these things at the local level. But it may take, without virtue, which is really the main thing in all of this, without virtuous men at the helm, it means that the system that we have set up starts to fail, because it assumes a virtuous population, a knowledgeable population, a population that has leaders at local levels who can then ascend, going through the right channels, building trust with the people they represent. If we don't have that, if it becomes a system of bribes, which I think it's approaching that, and a system of the higher up you get, the more corrupt it is. Yeah, it may take someone who is, ordained by God in a moment of providence to say, you know what, I climbed up this system, I'm rejecting all of it, and these guys are the bad guys, and I know people don't like to talk about that, but it's an uncomfortable thing, but it's just where we are. We have to. So, yeah.
Well, if you look at other imperial, top-down power structures that went away, sometimes that happens. Sometimes the decadence and just the sheer moral and actual bankruptcy just destroys things, and they completely fall apart and have to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Like, there's a lot of ways that it can happen, which is both my optimistic take and my pessimistic take. There's very few pleasant ways that it happens. Yeah, with the virtue and the self-governance. Yeah.
In Florida, they probably, like Ron DeSantis, they don't want a Caesarian figure. They just want to keep what they have. But in most other states, if they don't feel like they're being heard or the representatives don't care, then they're going to look for someone from the center. And that's a dangerous place to be in, because you don't know if that guy is going to be virtuous. He could claim it and then become the worst kind of dictator. So the best thing, and the thing that I recommend, is raising up leaders on the local level, bypassing some of the traditional, or I shouldn't say traditional, but bypassing some of the structures that gatekeep the virtuous people out, whether it's in church leadership or in political leadership. And then using things like the anti-commandeering doctrine, using even, once you probably have to attain a massive support, but getting to the point where you can nullify things and say our population, and we're going to stick behind this guy because we trust him. It takes time to build that, but I think that's still there. We can build that.
Yeah, and another problem with such short waves that come and go so quickly is it's very hard, and being separated from your history, it's very hard to say it's going to take us 20 years to get a Patrick Henry up to speed. Nobody wants to hear that. They want somebody to run in the midterms now, like instantly. Somebody that they, if you haven't been cultivating a relationship with a guy ahead of time, this just happened with the Big Beautiful Bill. The one Big Beautiful Bill was full of stuff that gun owners were supposed to like, and then it wasn't, and then maybe it could get better, and then it did, and everybody's hopes got raised, and then most of it got taken out. So the NFA still exists, even though the tax stamp for suppressors is zero. All the egregious stuff is in there. Well, a lot of gun owners are very let down. They're like, I'll never vote GOP again. I was like, well, you never should have been voting GOP in the first place. You should have been voting for specific people that you knew and you trusted in your local community, that not just waiting for the GOP to magically produce a principled, virtuous guy who was going to do this. That's not historically been what the GOP has produced when left to its own devices.
Yeah, I think if you're living in rural Virginia, where I was during 2020, you started to appreciate localism again, because the sheriff is going to protect you, and the local police won't enforce some of these draconian mandates. But if you're living in many of the blue areas or even red areas that are urban, you probably felt like this was everything that happened reinforced that we need someone to go clean up Washington. And the question I have is, why can't we figure, like, if you like the way that rural Virginia handled it, why don't we try to make your area like rural Virginia, right? Instead of making the whole country conform to Washington. I think the conservative instinct is, what did rural Virginia have that Philadelphia didn't? And obviously urbanization is part of this, but there's going to be different arrangements that also suit different populations. I don't know if you saw the video of Philadelphia over the weekend where there was basically an old Western gunfight. It's kind of
amazing. Yeah.
I mean, I was like, this is real. This isn't AI. And that there's going to be, when people can't limit their own choices, the government does have to limit their choices. I would rather that be contained in Philadelphia, though. I would rather the Philadelphia than to shell out more money for police. But the Democrats obviously aren't going to do this, but that's the solution for Philadelphia. It's not the whole country becoming Philadelphia. And
if people will not govern themselves, they will be governed. That's another important lesson from history that shows up.
It's inevitable.
But that is localism. I think people understand localism a lot better now than even 5 or 10 years ago. There was an assumption. Well, 20 years ago, there was an assumption that like New York was exactly the same as the place where I lived, only with bigger buildings, because we had a guy from New York in our neighborhood, and surely it's the same. I think the internet has changed our assumption of that. Philadelphia is not just like Centerville, but bigger. It is culturally different.
Yeah, I think what we're going to have to do in the red areas, especially the suburban and rural areas, is put up a lot of gates. And we're going to have to build up a lot of virtue. And that means we have to have good civic institutions to do that. And that is a defensive measure to keep out the kinds of things that are streaming in culturally and politically from the urban centers. And that's where I think America is the most preserved, is in those areas. When is New York City going to have the skyscraper is going to put their lights in an Easter formation of 3 crosses like they did in I think it was 56. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I can see a lot of small towns that would be totally behind that. So it's a strategy of, we have to go back into these areas probably as missionaries, but we need strong, red areas that are solidly Christian, culturally Christian, to be able to even do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would love to dig deeper into why Christianity is the anchor, why Christianity is the bedrock. Because there's more to it than it's just that's America's history and America should do that. And other countries that have a different historical religious foundation should rely on those. And I know that you would be very confident speaking to that, but I apologize to the viewers. We've had so many technical issues that you're getting a shorter than normal podcast, and I actually have to cut it off at this point. But Jon, I would love to have you back. I would love to have you back for a future, 6 or 7 try podcast recording where we were, and there's 2 things I really want to cover. One is I really do want to dig deeper into why does Christianity provide the foundation. Spoiler alert, you can also find that in the book, which I highly recommend. But also just some more of the history. Like today, there's a pretty big difference between New England cities and small American southern towns. But I mentioned this to you months ago. What's the difference even during those early years of America, and then hundreds of years later at the founding of the United States in the 1700s? What are some of the differences between those New England colonies and the southern colonies? Because they had really similar people in a lot of ways. You had English families for the most part, definitely others, but mostly English families coming over, and they had a Christian heritage. But you have a kind of stronger Scotch-Irish Presbyterian presence in the South, and you have a much more Puritan separatist presence in New England. And these cultural differences are really interesting to kind of look at and compare. I don't know that this T-Rex audience wants a super deep dive into like some of those different theological strains, but it is fascinating when we are separated from our history. There are cultural things that are very mysterious to us, and I think it's required for us to understand them in order to know how to either fix things back they were before, or sometimes if there's I would say sometimes if there's stuff that you don't want to repeat in the past, that you don't want to repeat in the future. You have to understand how you got there, whether it's really good history that you want to get back to or bad effects that you don't want to repeat. Either way, you have to have an understanding of history. It's really non-negotiable.
Yeah, and I think for gun rights guys, those cultural differences mean a lot. In New England, punishing crime was more of a corporate thing. Society did. Everyone marched in lockstep, and they had sort of a mandate to expand the kingdom of God, and that became secularized. But in the South, a lot of the crime and things were handled on a personal basis by local people, and it was much more decentralized. So these things play into our modern debates too.
Yeah.
And I think
for sure.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting for your audience.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much, Jon. I apologize for my technical side, but I think that you win on the technical glitches today. So maybe we should have a rematch.
Yeah. Well, God bless. I appreciate it, Isaac, and thank you for your long suffering with my issues, which are pretty random. I don't know if the devil's behind it, but we got through it, and I hope this was helpful to people.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic start to a conversation. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for your work on the book, and I highly recommend to T-Rex listeners, check out the book Against the Waves, and look out for future conversations with Jon. If you can ever get your computer up and running again, we'll dive a little deeper into some of the history.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Isaac.